Scott, it's great to connect today. Thanks for coming on the podcast.
Nate, I'm thrilled to be here. Thanks for having me.
You've thought a lot about innovation, and so I'm curious, what lesson have you learned about innovation that you would most like to share with others?
The lesson I would most like to share with others is that every innovation story has heroes, and that word is plural. So I can certainly happy to talk about that in more depth, but that's the headline of the lesson.
So I just interviewed Martin Reeves and Bob Goodson. Bob is one of the creators of the like, and it was interesting to hear their take on innovation. So I'd love to dig into this. So yeah, uh, let me just say that again. So yeah, I'd love to dig into this.
Great. So let me tell you a story then to just to illustrate this idea that every innovation has heroes. So if you were to pick up a cookbook and you were to open up that cookbook and look at a recipe, every cookbook just about follows a particular format, which is on the left side of the page, there are ingredients. On the right side of the page, there's the recipe. Now, that's not accidental. Someone actually came up with that, and that someone was Julia Child, the French chef, Mastering the Art of French Cooking, 1961, her breakthrough book. That was the format that she picked because she was really good at putting herself in the shoes of the person who was going to pick up and use the book. And she thought the easiest way to communicate a recipe is by doing that. Ingredients on the left, the actual recipe on the right. We take it for granted now, but everything in the world today traces back to somebody having an idea and doing something about it. So the thing that's important in that is a lot of people think, well, I'm not Steve Jobs or Jeff Bezos or whatever, so I can't possibly be an innovator. But everybody, and I mean everybody, has the capabilities of doing something different that creates value, which is how I define innovation.
Did I read somewhere that Julia Child is somehow connected to cryptocurrency?
That I do not know. It would not surprise me. Now she passed away before distributed ledger technologies and cryptocurrency was born. But the world is a weird world and weird connections are made, so that would not surprise me if she was in some way.
I might have to edit this. I was thinking in your I saw something.
Yes, no, you're right, actually. You're right. I'm like, this is funny. So we're both having our four kids senior moments today. In the end of the book, Epic Disruptions, I talk about disruptions that echo off of the stories in the book. Epic Disruptions tells 11 historical stories about disruption. Julia Child is one of them. And the in-process disruption that I tie to Julia Child is indeed cryptocurrency and distributed ledger technologies. And the reason why I did that is when Julia was sending around manuscripts of her book to people, she told people, please do not share this. She was really concerned about asset ownership. And one of the big things that you can do with distributed ledger technologies, of which cryptocurrency is the one that most people know, is you can have something that basically is a spreadsheet that everyone can see that shows exactly who owned what at various times, which means beyond the speculative things that people do with cryptocurrency, there's a lot that you can do with it for asset ownership and so on. So it's a little bit of a leap from Julia Child to cryptocurrency, but that was the connection I made in the book.
Yeah, interesting. And so I'm curious about some of these innovations that have shaped our modern world.
Well, the book starts with gunpowder. So I go back way to 1453, gunpowder's coming of age moment when a big cannon helped topple the walls of Constantinople, which had stood for more than 1,000 years, and trace that story back to its origins of about 130. So it's a pretty long story, but told over about 20 pages. And then we go to the printing press, scientific revolution, Henry Ford's Model T, the transistor, disposable diapers, Julia Child, and a few others. And what I try to do in the book is by telling these stories, go and explore some of the key principles and practices that allows disruptive change to happen. And again, this idea that these stories each have heroes is something that really, really struck me. Because, we talk a lot about innovators, and often people think about this iconic figure, like again, a Steve Jobs or a Jeff Bezos or whatever. But those people don't do anything on their own. Even Julia Child, she's a name that you associate with cooking. Her first book had two co-authors, Simca Beck and Louisette Berthold. That book would not have been published without the indispensable help of her friend Avis Devato, who introduced her to Judy Jones, who helped to publish the book. None of it would have happened without her husband Paul, who was her partner in many ways. When they're working on the recipe to cook French bread, they run 284 experiments to figure out how to do it. And Paul is there helping to design, document, and take learnings from those experiments. So these stories are all the same because you have these groups of people that are doing things. So anyone can do it, and it requires a team to ultimately succeed. It's not the pursuit of an individual, it's the pursuit of a collective.
So why do you think our society, culture, uh, likes to attribute the creative genius to a single person?
It's a very Western idea, I think. I spent 12 years living in Singapore, so I have seen different perspectives on topics. And in societies that are more Confucian in orientation, you wouldn't see that. It's not as individualistic an approach, and people would think about teams, organizations, history, and so on. But our society very much appreciates the star quarterback, the star innovator, the star politician, whatever it is. And we sometimes forget in that no one does anything on their own. You just can't do it on your own. You need to have the quarterback has to have someone who catches the ball, someone who blocks the people who whatever. We know all that, but we sometimes can forget it. And that's a real problem because everybody's got an important role to play.
That's really interesting because in my PhD, I remember learning about individualistic and collectivist societies. And so, Western nations being more individualistic and uh, Asian nations generally more collectivist. And I didn't think of it in terms of ascribing innovation, that it would also fall into those two camps. So as you were describing, the heroes, and I asked my question, why does our society and culture do this? I was actually thinking this was a global phenomenon. So that was interesting to hear you say, no, this is actually, in other cultures, it's not quite this way.
Yeah, no, and of course, cultures. There's no monoculture. You get subcultures, as you well know. So you'll see different things in different places. And I've seen companies that are based in the East that act even more West than Western than Western companies, and vice versa. But I think certainly you see big differences there. And one of the things more broadly that I just greatly appreciated about the time living overseas and the opportunity to do work in a bunch of different countries, you just see the world through other lenses. And that just helps you realize that it is not a black and white world. There are lots of shades in between. And I think one of the greatest gifts that my wife and I gave to our kids is the opportunity to spend some years living overseas. It literally changes the way that you think and helps you realize that, again, there's not one answer to almost any question.
So did you always want to write a book about epic disruptions?
The the short stories, no. I mean, I've written other books. Disruptive innovation has been a theme of my life for the last 25 years. This book was not my idea. This book was actually pitched to me by the publisher, which has not happened before.
Hmm.
So I had another book that I had an idea for. It's a class that I teach at Tuck called Leading Disruptive Change. And I pitched that to the publisher saying, I want to write a book based on this class. And Kevin Evers said, interesting idea. However, a germ of an idea came up in a brainstorming session we had. What do you think about it? This idea of writing a book tracing the history of disruptive innovation. And at first, I'm like, well, that's not my idea. That's not what I want to work on. I want to do this other thing. But then I sat with it and I played with it and I said, you know what? That's actually a really good idea. And I said, let's give it a go. And I'm so glad I did because I learned so much going back into history. Just again, something that I've not done before. I've never written a more history-like book. It was really rewarding and just really educational. So every time I see Kevin or email him or whatever, I thank him for that germ of an idea he gave me.
So as you were writing this book and researching for this book, what was the most surprising thing you learned about disruptive innovation?
I think the most surprising thing I learned is in the beginning of the chapter about Francis Bacon and Robert Boyle. And this is a 1548 proclamation from King Edward VI. The proclamation was essentially against innovation, saying innovation is a bad thing. And the thing that then triggered a thought around is my entire life I have spent helping people to innovate, helping people to think about innovation, talking about how great innovation is. And I believe all that. It is great. But the thing I realized from the book is that innovation also casts a shadow. Why did the king issue a proclamation against it? Well, one of the lines in the proclamation is it tends both to confusion and disorder and to the high displeasure of Almighty God, who loves nothing so much as order and obedience.
Hmm.
If you were an innovator, you were questioning the status quo, which meant you were questioning the king and questioning God. And that was not perceived to be a good thing. And that's what innovators do. They question the status quo. That's good for some, but that's bad for others. When you get advancements, when new technologies get introduced, there are winners and there are losers, and there's pain during transition processes. So that shadow of innovation, I never had language for. I had never seen as clearly as I did in the research.
Yeah, really interesting how it can be so threatening. It's easy to think, I spent time in Silicon Valley and so it just, it's in the air there. Innovation is good, innovation is progress. But looking at innovation from another angle, like it is threatening and it is quite dangerous. So really interesting ideas from Epic Disruptions. Uh, how about practical takeaway? Like, okay, so there, innovations have heroes, plural. What can people take away from this that would impact them in their day-to-day lives?
So if you run the through line through that idea, innovation has heroes. So I said Julia Child, she had a bunch of people who helped her. If you look at the chapter about the printing press, why was it Gutenberg in Germany? Why did it happen there? Well, he was in a place where there were a bunch of presses because it was a wine growing region. And he was in Strasbourg when he was working on the technology where there were a lot of people who were doing engravings on bells. He was at a place where intersections happen, where different technologies could come together. So the practical takeaway from this idea is you want to get better at innovation, do it with other people, find ways to get to intersections where you're going to see and think and feel about things in different sorts of ways. So if you're in one industry, go to a trade show in a different industry. If you care about one field, read a magazine in a different field. Collaborate with different people, collaborate with different types of ideas. It is a time-tested way to be better at innovation.
Yeah, it's interesting because it might be tempting for some to think, I'm just going to, sit in my basement and think, and I'm going to come up with some great idea. And as your research shows, that it's just not, if you're playing the odds, that's just not the likely way it's going to happen. I love this phrase, find ways to get to intersections, which, when I was out in Bay Area, you'd hear a number of venture capitalists say, and their advice to people was, look, if you want to be on the cutting edge of technology, AI now, move to San Francisco. Now, maybe that doesn't matter quite as much with uh, Zoom meetings and people co-located, but even still, whether you're in person uh, or just interacting through online conferences or reading groups, finding intersections finding intersections has got to be, or it seems like it is one of the most crucial aspects of innovation then.
Totally agree. And the other thing, Nate, that I do as a regular habit, I have 4 kids. I spend time with them, and I don't just ask them what they're playing around with. I play around with what they're playing around with them, as much as it sometimes drives them crazy. You know the line, William Gibson, the future's already arrived, it's just not very evenly distributed. And kids are early adopters of new technologies. So that might be playing Minecraft or Roblox with one of the kids, or when we lived in Singapore, my oldest son, Charlie, actually had a cryptocurrency startup. And then he had a turn a couple years ago, actually last year, as a social media star. So, that's a whole different story. But then just watching what they're doing and participating in it, it's a great way to just see what new technologies are there and keep yourself current. And, spending time with kids is not a bad thing either.
Yeah, that's great. I just interviewed Ken Shanmugam. He is one of the leading Supreme Court attorneys, and he's getting to the age now where he said he one of his main goals is finding the young talent that he can work with. And it's just an interesting shift because as we get older, it's easy to feel like the older we get, the more experience we have, the more we know. And I see myself just in the last few years feeling like, oh, the young people, like they're the ones that know, they're the ones that are going to create. Now, of course, older people create too, but I love this idea of like let's play with what the young kids are doing. And I was just thinking this in terms of music. It's easy for the adults to say like, oh, this new music, it's no good. If only it was as good as our music, or you're going to embrace it. And so in 2 weeks, I'm going to a concert with my kids for a band that they love. When I first heard their music, I did not like it. Then I started like giving it a chance, started listening a little more, and I was like, actually, this is really good stuff. And I can't wait to go to the concert. And I never would have been introduced to this music but for the kids.
I think it's a great example. And, there's no better way to stay young than to spend time with young people. So I think a great example.
Any final things you'd like to share as we wrap up here, Scott?
Yeah, I think I would just come back to what we started with, this idea that every story has heroes. Innovation, remember, is not the job of the few, it's the responsibility of the many. And you don't have to be in a great big company to do it. There are ways to change morning routines, change the way that you're interacting with your kid, your spouse, your friends, whatever. There's lots of ways that you can do something different that creates value, and it's not that hard. Just give it a go.
Great. Thanks so much, Scott. Love talking about innovation. You've given me some new insights that I look forward to revisiting, and I look forward to listening to this episode again. So thanks so much for coming on today, Scott.
Thanks for having me, Nate. Appreciate it.